I want you to close your eyes and just picture something for me for a second. Put yourself right into this environment.
Yeah, get a vivid mental image going.
Exactly. You are standing on a steel deck, and it is the pitch black night of November 21st, 1902. You are out on the freezing, churning waters of Lake Superior.
And the weather is just, I mean, it's catastrophic.
Right. The wind isn't just blowing, it is howling. Like it's shrieking through the metal rigging above you like some sort of living thing. Blinding snow is whipping across the deck so violently that it feels like shattered glass just hitting your exposed skin.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's incredibly bleak.
It really is. And beneath your feet is this massive steel freighter loaded down with 85,000 bushels of grain. It's this heavy, lumbering, groaning beast of a machine, and it is sailing directly into one of the most violent storms of the century.
Which basically makes you a prisoner to the elements.
Exactly. You are essentially standing on a steel island in the dark. Surrounding you is just an angry, freezing ocean. There are no lights on the horizon. There is, no radio to call for help. You are completely terrifyingly isolated.
Yeah.
And then somewhere in that freezing dark, the lights just go out forever. And the ship simply ceases to exist.
The psychological weight of that exact moment right before the end, it's almost impossible for a modern mind to fully comprehend.
It really is.
That absolute isolation,
Yeah.
the realization that you are entirely at the mercy of a lake that, frankly, acts like a ferocious ocean,
Mhm.
a body of water that is famous for rarely giving up its dead.
Right.
You're just trapped in this industrial box, completely disconnected from the rest of humanity, basically just waiting for the ice and the water to win.
Yeah, it's chilling. So for this deep dive today, we've got ship logs, newspaper clippings from 1902, weather reports, and centuries of local ghost stories on the table.
A huge stack of sources for this one.
Yeah, a massive stack. And we're going to use them to figure out how a 245-foot steel leviathan simply evaporated into the winter night. We're talking about the SS Bannockburn. It's this infamous missing freighter that vanished under such horrifying circumstances that it eventually became known as the Flying Dutchman of the Great Lakes.
Which is such a heavy title to carry. And honestly, it remains one of the most enduring, unsettling maritime mysteries in North American history.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it's a story that blends, hard, brutal historical facts, technological hubris, and just deep-seated folklore. And the detail that transforms this from like a tragic shipwreck into a lasting horror story is the absolute void it left behind.
Complete silence.
Exactly. There were no survivors. There were no distress calls. There was absolutely no wreckage found out on the water.
Well, save for one single terrifying piece of physical evidence that washed ashore weeks later, which we will definitely get to because the implications of it are pure nightmare fuel.
Oh, yeah. We have to talk about that later.
But before we get to the end, to really understand how this massive machine vanished, we have to look at what the Bannockburn actually was, because looking back at the timeline, it really feels like this vessel was dragging a shadow of doom behind it from the very beginning.
It really does.
Ah.
To understand the ship, we have to understand the era and the mindset of the people who built it. So this was 1893.
Okay.
The Bannockburn was built in Middlesbrough, England by Sir Railton Dixon and Company.
Yeah.
And we need to frame what shipbuilding was like at this exact moment in history. The maritime world was transitioning away from wooden schooners.
Right, moving into the modern age of steel.
Exactly. The Bannockburn was commissioned by the Montreal Transportation Company, and it was one of their very first steel-hulled ships. They bought it to maintain a competitive edge in what was a booming, ruthless industry.
So this wasn't just another boat on the lake. This was like a technological flex. It was cutting-edge, late 19th century innovation.
A massive industrial flex, yeah. And the Montreal Transportation Company made sure everyone knew it, too. They designed it with a very distinctive profile, one that stuck out immediately among the older vessels on the Great Lakes.
How big was it exactly?
It was 245 feet long, had a beam of just over 40 feet, and a 21-foot depth. It weighed in at over 1,600 gross tons. And the heart of this beast, the thing keeping it moving, was a massive triple-expansion steam engine powered by 2 Scotch boilers, which drove a single massive propeller.
Wait, stop right there for a second because I want to make sure we actually understand the machinery we're talking about here. Triple expansion steam engine and Scotch boilers. I mean, that sounds impressive, but what does that actually mean for the guys working down in the belly of the ship? What is that physical environment actually like?
Oh, it's brutal. Picture a multi-story iron cavern deep inside the ship. It's deafeningly loud, vibrating constantly. A Scotch boiler is essentially a massive steel cylinder filled with water, with a furnace built directly into the middle of it. So men, who are known as coal stokers, are constantly, endlessly shoveling coal into these roaring fires to boil the surrounding water.
In the pitch black, basically, just lit by the fire.
Right, and that creates immense, highly pressurized steam. The triple expansion part means that this pressurized steam doesn't just push one piston, it's channeled to push a small, high-pressure piston, then it expands into a medium cylinder to push another one, and finally expands again into a massive, low-pressure cylinder. It extracts literally every ounce of energy from the steam.
So you just have this relentless mechanical heartbeat going on. The heat down there must have been unbearable, especially, contrasted with the freezing water just inches away on the other side of that steel hull.
That contrast was lethal in more ways than one, which we'll definitely discuss when we look at how steel reacts to cold. But yes, on its maiden voyage on the Great Lakes, this incredible machine traveled from Port Arthur, Ontario to Kingston, Ontario in just 4.5 days.
Wow, so it was fast.
Incredibly fast. It was immensely strong, and it was specifically designed to utterly dominate the grain trade.
But despite all that cutting-edge 1890s tech, this ship had a staggering track record of just awful luck. I was looking at the timeline, and in 1897, so just 4 years after it was launched, it sank.
Yeah.
It literally sank in lock number 17 of the Welland Canal.
Right. It struck the stone wall of the canal and began to submerge. Now, it was salvaged mostly because it was in a confined canal and didn't fully go under into deep water.
Yeah.
But that is a massive structural trauma for a young vessel.
Because of the weight distribution?
Exactly. A ship is designed to have the pressure of water evenly distributed across its hull. When it hits a stone wall and rests unevenly on the bottom, the sheer weight of the ship warps the internal framing.
Wow. And the hits just keep coming for this boat. Let's fast forward to the year of its disappearance, 1902. In April of that year, the Bannockburn is steaming along and violently grounds itself on the Snake Island Shoal.
Yeah, another huge impact.
And it wasn't a gentle scrape either. It hit the shoal running at full speed. They had to dump part of their cargo just to float again. The historical logs note that the forefoot in the frame of the ship were badly, quote, stove in. Let's translate that for the listener. What does stove in actually look like on a steel ship? Are we talking about like a minor dent, or is the hull practically torn open?
Oh, it's far worse than a dent. Stove in means the massive steel hull plates were violently pushed inward, warping the structural ribs of the ship itself. It's not just a dent in a car bumper. These steel plates are held together by thousands of iron rivets.
Okay.
So when a steel hull is stove in, those rivets undergo massive shearing stress. Some might pop, leaving tiny gaps. The steel plates themselves become fatigued, and we really have to consider the metallurgy of 1893 here.
Right, they weren't making modern steel back then.
Exactly. The steel they were producing back then was highly susceptible to something called brittle fracture.
Brittle fracture, meaning like the cold makes it shatter rather than bend.
That's exactly the issue. Modern ship steel is designed to remain ductile flexible, even in freezing temperatures. Late 19th century steel was absolutely not. In the freezing waters of Lake Superior, that steel became extremely brittle.
So it's basically glass at that point.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
If you take a ship that already has a compromised stove-in frame and you subject that brittle steel to the twisting, violent waves of a November storm, you are operating a machine that is fundamentally waiting to tear itself apart.
Which makes this next detail deeply disturbing. We arrive at November 20th, 1902, the very day the Bannockburn departs Fort William for its final voyage, loaded with all that grain. And what happens?
It runs aground again.
Again. It hits the bottom, delays its own departure, and then they just decide to keep going. I mean, if they ground it twice in 1 year and the chief engineer knew they had structural damage, why on earth didn't the crew mutiny? Or at least refuse to sail? Was the payout for a late November run really worth dying for?
To understand that decision, you really have to look at the suffocating economic pressure of the era. The Great Lakes grain trade was incredibly lucrative, but it was governed by an absolute, unforgiving, ticking clock, which was the winter freeze.
Right, because once the ice comes in, nobody is moving anything.
Exactly. Captain George R. Wood and his chief engineer George Booth were in charge of a crew of 20 men. They were in a desperate race against the ice. If you didn't make those final late-season runs, you lost out on massive payouts. And worse, you risked your standing with the Montreal Transportation Company.
It's the ultimate clash of capitalism versus safety. The company wants the grain moved, the ice is closing in, and the men need the wages to survive the winter.
The psychological weight of that pressure cannot be overstated. You have a crew, many of them young men from Kingston, who rely entirely on these seasonal wages. Captain Wood knows his ship hit a shoal in April. He knows it grounded just hours ago.
I read that a blacksmith in port even noted that the Bannockburn's rudder quadrant was cracked before they left.
Yeah, there were warnings everywhere.
Yeah.
He knows it is late November on Lake Superior, a time notoriously known as the gales of November. But the demands of commerce pushed them forward anyway. They likely rationalized the damage. They trusted that a massive steam engine. They chose commerce over caution, a decision dictated entirely by the brutal economics of 1902.
Think about how terrifying that is when you put yourself in their shoes. You're a young sailor, maybe 19 years old. You felt the shudder when the ship grounded that morning. You heard the metal scrape.
You know something is wrong.
Right, but you don't complain because complaining gets you fired, and then your family starves. You just go down into the dark, freezing belly of this steel beast, surrounded by tons of grain, and you sail out into the black water.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the final voyage. Let's trace their route into the void because the environment around them immediately starts closing in.
We can piece together its last known movements through the eyes of the other sailors who were out on the water that day. It creates a very chilling chronology of a ship slowly being swallowed by a hostile environment.
Right, so we're looking at November 21st, 1902. It starts off entirely mundane. At 7 a.m., two sailors, Charles O'Toole and John Lyon, report seeing the Bannockburn near Passage Island, just northeast of Isle Royale.
Yep, a standard sighting.
Nothing seems amiss. It's just a heavily laden ship making its run.
But as the day progresses, the atmospheric pressure over Lake Superior begins to drop dramatically. The sky changes. The temperature plummets.
By late afternoon, the dread really starts to build. Captain James McMaw is at the helm of the upbound steamer Algonquin. He spots the Bannockburn about 80 miles off Queenaw Point. The Algonquin and the Bannockburn are very similar ships, right?
Very similar, yeah.
Yeah.
Both seal-hulled, both built in the UK. So Captain McMahon knows exactly what he's looking at.
He sees that distinct profile, and you can just picture this cinematic, eerie visual, this massive steel silhouette cutting through the gray, choppy water. And then rolling banks of thick, gray fog start moving in. McMaw stands on his deck and watches as the fog just swallows the Bannockburn. He loses sight of them entirely.
And that fog wasn't just a mist. It was the vanguard of a massive atmospheric collision. A classic Great Lakes November witch storm where freezing Arctic air plunges down from Canada and collides with the relatively warmer moisture rising off the lake.
It's just a recipe for disaster. By 11:00 p.m., things have gone from ominous to outright horrific. The passenger steamer Huron is out there too. The crew looks out into the pitch-black night and they spot the lights of a ship passing in the dark.
And they presume it's the Bannockburn.
Right, because so late in the season, who else could it be? There are no distress signals, no flares, just a silent ship glowing faintly in the freezing mist passing into the void.
And we know exactly what kind of hell they were sailing into thanks to the records from the Huron.
Yeah, the waiter on the Huron, a man named Fred Landon, kept a journal. His entry for that night is terrifying. He recorded it as the worst storm of the season. The storm was so incredibly violent that it actually damaged the massive engines of the Huron.
And the Huron was a sturdy, modern passenger steamer.
Exactly. Just to give you an idea of the sheer carnage across the Great Lakes that week. 67 sailors perished in that specific storm system. Ships like the Charles Hebard, the Aloha, the Celtic, all victims of the same gales.
It was an absolute meteorological slaughter. The waves on Lake Superior during a storm like this don't act like ocean waves. Ocean waves have a long period that sort of roll. Great Lakes waves are steep, short period waves.
So they hit closer together.
Right. They act like a series of rapid-fire concrete walls just continually slamming into the side of a ship.
Think about how panicked you feel today when you lose cell service on a dark highway and your car starts making a weird noise. Now multiply that panic by 1,000. That is what the crew of the Bannockburn was experiencing. 20 men. As the Huron battles the storm, the Bannockburn is out there somewhere too. It is pitch black.
Total darkness.
The only light is whatever flickering lamps they have on board. The wind is deafening. You cannot hear the man shouting right next to you. Freezing, heavy waves are crashing over the steel deck, tons of icy water threatening to crush the hatch covers. Below deck, the stove-in hull is groaning. And you have the horrifying realization that if the ship breaks, literally no one is coming for you.
That vulnerability is profound. In early 20th century navigation, they had no GPS. They had no radar to see the shore in the fog. They had no immediate ship-to-shore radio.
If the ship starts taking on water, you can't just hit a distress button and have the Coast Guard dispatch a helicopter.
No, there is no Coast Guard helicopter. Navigation was done primarily by dead reckoning.
Let's break down dead reckoning for a second, because it sounds like guesswork, and in a storm, it basically is, right?
It essentially is, yes. Dead reckoning involves calculating your current position based on a previously known position. You say, okay, we passed Passage Island at 7 a.m. We're traveling at 10 knots. Our compass heading is southeast. Therefore, in 5 hours, we should be right here on the map. The problem is, a massive storm introduces variables you can't measure perfectly. The wind pushes you off course. The current slows you down.
And you mentioned earlier that compasses up there weren't entirely reliable either.
No. Lake Superior is surrounded by massive iron ore deposits. Those deposits create magnetic anomalies that can cause a ship's compass to deviate wildly.
Wow, that's terrifying.
It is. So your heading is slightly off, your speed is being altered by waves, and suddenly your dead reckoning is a complete fiction. You rely on lighthouse flashes to correct your math. But in a blinding snowstorm, those lights are completely obscured. You are sailing blind, in a steel box, over a body of water that drops to depths of over 1,000 feet. If a hatch breaches or if that cracked rudder quadrant snaps completely, rendering you unable to steer into the waves, you are dead.
It's a claustrophobic nightmare. The monster is the weather itself, and there is no escape. And as that storm finally breaks the next day, the physical horror out at sea transitions into a harrowing, drawn-out psychological torture for the families waiting on the mainland.
The agonizing wait. This is a common theme in maritime disasters, but the Bannockburn case has a particularly cruel twist regarding how the public and the families were manipulated.
Yeah, so the Bannockburn was scheduled to arrive at the Soo Locks, the gateway between Lake Superior and Lake Huron. It doesn't show up. At first, there's no immediate panic. People rationalize it. They assume the crew took shelter behind an island and dropped anchor to ride out the worst storm of the season.
Which is a very normal procedure.
Right. But as the days turn into a full week, that silence becomes suffocating.
You really have to imagine the families in Kingston, wives, mothers, children, walking down to the telegraph office every single day in the freezing cold, just waiting for a word. The anxiety slowly metastasizing into grief as they realize the ship is missing.
But then, on November 27th and 28th, a twisted glimmer of hope emerges. We're talking about the 1902 version of fake news. Telegrams suddenly get blasted out across the wire to the families in the newspapers. The Fort William Times-Journal reports that the ship is safe behind Sleet Island.
Just completely out of nowhere.
Yes. The British Whig newspaper in Kingston reports a message from the Chicago Underwriters Association saying, quote, "The steamer Bannockburn has been located on the north shore of Lake Superior, opposite Michipicoten Island. Crew safe." They even cite a source. They claim another freighter, the Germanic, brought the news to port.
Imagine the emotional whiplash those families experienced. To grieve for a week and then be handed official printed confirmation that your husband or your son is alive.
The families in Kingston literally celebrate in the streets. They think their boys are coming home. But it is entirely false. It is a devastating miscommunication or an outright callous lie. Because when the authorities track down the crew of the Germanic, the crew says, "We have no idea what you're talking about. We saw nothing. If we had seen a grounded ship, we would have stopped to help."
It's sickening.
The man who sent the telegram, a superintendent of marine insurance in Chicago, later admits he didn't have positive information and couldn't even recall where he heard the rumor.
It is remarkably cruel, and it really speaks to the chaos of early communication networks.
But why does that happen? I mean, why would anyone spread a rumor of their survival with such authority? Was it just an honest mistake in a game of telephone, or was it something more malicious, like maybe a desperate attempt to protect insurance premiums from skyrocketing?
There may have been financial motives among the underwriters, certainly, to delay paying out a massive policy on a brand new steel ship. But fundamentally, this stems from the human brain's utter rejection of ambiguity.
What do you mean?
When a massive, permanent object, a 245-foot steel machine, just evaporates, the human mind cannot process it. We need a narrative. In the absence of facts, rumors fill the void. Someone hears a whisper on the docks that a ship was seen near an island. It gets repeated to a telegraph operator. It gets amplified by desperate hope, and suddenly it's printed as fact.
We see this exact psychological phenomenon today. Think of the El Faro sinking in 2015, or the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975, or even missing aircraft like MH370. The sudden, inexplicable loss of an entire massive vehicle leaves a vacuum. People desperately try to fill it with conspiracy theories, with false hope, or with denial.
It's a coping mechanism.
Exactly. The reality that the ship is in pieces at the bottom of the lake and everyone is dead is simply too brutal to accept without physical proof.
But the physical proof for the Bannockburn was coming, and it wasn't the kind they wanted. After the fake news is debunked and the hope is shattered, the search becomes completely desolate.
Tugs like the Boynton and the Favorite head out. They battle freezing gales to search the coastlines and the islands. They scour Michipicket Island and Caribou Island. They find absolutely nothing. The entire ship has vanished until December 13th.
The grim discovery.
Right. A patrol from the Grand Marais Life-Saving Station is walking the freezing, icy shoreline in Michigan, and they find a single life preserver washed up on the beach. It's the only verified piece of physical evidence of the Bannockburn ever found.
Wow, just one vest.
Just one. And the details of this life preserver are the stuff of absolute nightmares. The official report notes that the shoulder straps of the preserver are tied. And on the heavy canvas, there are what appear to be bloodstains. The investigators conclude that the vest was, quote, washed from the dead.
That single object tells a horrifying story of the final minutes of the Bannockburn.
Because if the straps are tied, it means someone put it on. Someone had the time, amidst the absolute chaos of a sinking ship in the pitch black, to tie the canvas straps over their shoulders. And the bloodstains imply blunt force trauma.
Yeah, that they were injured before going into the water.
It implies that a sailor was wearing it, was perhaps crushed or battered against the steel deck as the ship violently rolled, and then the sheer force of the sinking ship, or the freezing waves, ripped the preserver off his body and sent it miles to the shore.
It shatters any comforting illusion the families might have had that the sinking was peaceful or instantaneous, that the ship just quietly slipped beneath the waves. The tied, blood-stained vest indicates a violent, terrifying struggle for survival in the dark.
And with no survivors to tell the tale, and only this bloody canvas vest left behind, investigators and historians are left to perform an autopsy on a disappearance. They have to examine an environment that is essentially an incredibly hostile, 1,000-foot-deep crime scene to deduce what actually killed the Bannockburn.
Because without the wreck itself, all we have are theories based on weather patterns, the ship's prior structural damage, and the jagged, hidden geography of Lake Superior.
So let's meticulously break down the theories. Theory number 1, the boiler explosion. This was the immediate theory put forward by Captain McMaw of the Algonquin, the guy who saw the Bannockburn vanish into the fog earlier that afternoon. He thought maybe one of those massive Scotch boilers blew up and just instantly obliterated the ship, sending it down in seconds.
It's a plausible theory on its face, considering the immense pressure those boilers were under.
Yeah.
But it falls apart under scrutiny.
Really?
Well, by 1902, boiler explosions, while they did still happen, were becoming increasingly rare due to better engineering and mandatory safety relief valves. Furthermore, the Algonquin was not that far away from the Bannockburn's last known position.
If 2 massive Scotch boilers had exploded with enough force to instantly snap a 245-foot steel freighter in half, the sound of that detonation would have carried over the water.
Exactly. The concussive wave would have been immense. The crew of the Algonquin surely would have heard the blast or felt the shock wave in the water, even over the howling wind. But they heard nothing. The Bannockburn simply faded away.
Okay, so cross off a catastrophic explosion. That brings us to theory number 2, the Caribou Island Reef. We know from records that the Caribou Island lighthouse had already been turned off for the winter season. The keeper had gone home. Did the structurally compromised Bannockburn, sailing blind on dead reckoning in a blizzard, strike the deadly reef surrounding Caribou Island in the dark?
This theory holds significant weight. We know the ship had a history of hitting shoals. The captain was racing the ice and might have cut his corners too close to the island. A few days after the disappearance, the steamer, Frank D. Rockefeller, reported passing through a massive field of floating debris near the Standard Rock lighthouse.
Oh, interesting.
Right, and some investigators theorized this was the shattered wooden remains of the Bannockburn's cabins.
But if you look at a map of Lake Superior, the physics of the wind don't line up, do they? If the debris field is at Standard Rock, it doesn't make sense that the ship hit Caribou Island.
That is the glaring geographical mismatch. Standard Rock is well to the southwest of Caribou Island. The prevailing northwest winds of that specific storm wouldn't have carried debris from Caribou Island against the wind to Standard Rock in that pattern.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, there was nothing in the debris field to positively identify it as the Bannockburn. There were no wooden nameplates, no marked lifeboats, no oars. It could have been wreckage from literally any of the other dozens of ships destroyed that week.
Which means if it didn't hit Caribou Island, where was it? What else was out there hiding in the dark? And that brings us to Theory 3. And to me, this is the most terrifying possibility of all. Superior Shoal.
Yeah, this one is chilling.
I want to detail the sheer horror of this underwater geography for you. The Superior Shoal is essentially a jagged, underwater granite mountain peak located right in the middle of the lake, about 50 miles north of Copper Harbor. And here is the kicker. In 1902, this massive underwater mountain was completely uncharted. Nobody knew it was there. And it sat directly on the course the Bannockburn was likely taking.
It is a submerged assassin, a geological hazard perfectly positioned to destroy a deep draft commercial vessel.
Imagine you're driving an 18-wheeler down a highway at 70 miles an hour in pitch blackness, and someone dropped a solid granite skyscraper horizontally across the road, right at bumper height. That is Superior Shoal. Picture the final moments under this theory. You are in a structurally weakened ship. Your frame was bent in April. You grounded again that very morning, stressing the brittle steel.
It's already ready to break.
Exactly. You are in a massive, chaotic sea state. The ship surfs down the face of a massive wave in the pitch black. The water trough drops the ship incredibly low, exposing the hull. And right there, waiting in the dark beneath the freezing foam, is a jagged mountain of solid rock. You violently impale the steel hull onto the mountain at full speed.
The metal rips open. The freezing water rushes into the cargo holds. And this is where the cargo itself becomes a weapon.
The 85,000 bushels of grain.
Yes. When grain gets wet, it acts like a sponge. It absorbs the water and expands rapidly.
I want to make sure people understand the physics of that. How much force does expanding grain actually exert? Is it really enough to burst a steel ship?
Immense hydraulic pressure. Far more than enough to pop the iron rivets holding a 19th century ship together. If the hull is breached and water floods the hold, the grain swells, pushing outward against the steel plates with thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. The ship is literally bursting at the seams from the inside out, while simultaneously flooding and being battered by storm waves.
It's a catastrophic structural failure on every level. Within minutes, the massive steel box plummets into the abyss, plunging into water 1,000 feet deep, taking all 20 men to the bottom before they even have a chance to launch a lifeboat. It's so fast, the only thing that has time to float away is a single life vest ripped from a dying man's shoulders.
It is a chillingly plausible minute-by-minute scenario. And if you look at historical comparisons, it mirrors another legendary Lake Superior disaster almost perfectly.
The Edmund Fitzgerald.
The parallels are uncanny. Both were massive freighters for their time. Both faced catastrophic, record-breaking November storms. Both vanished completely without a trace, without a single distress call.
Right.
And for both ships, the leading theories revolve around striking unlit, deadly shoals, the uncharted Superior Shoal for the Bannockburn, and the 6-fathom shoal near Caribou Island for the Fitzgerald.
It really forces you to internalize the sheer scale and absolute hostility of the ocean, because Lake Superior is an inland ocean. You are in a massive steel box. You think you are protected by industrial progress and triple expansion engines, but that box can impale itself, flood, and plummet to the bottom of a freezing trench so fast that you don't even have time to understand you're dying. The vulnerability of the human body in that environment is absolute.
And because the physical ship was lost to those icy depths, and because the trauma of its sudden disappearance was so profound for the maritime community, it birthed a phantom. This is where we transition from the hard, brutal engineering history of the shipping lanes into the chilling folklore of the lakes. The trauma created a ghost.
The afterlife of the SS Bannockburn, the birth of the Flying Dutchman of the Great Lakes. And what's fascinating is that when you look at the source documents, this legend wasn't entirely organic. It didn't just bubble up from the whispers of sailors on the docks. It was actually popularized, almost engineered by an author.
Yes, the author James Oliver Curwood, in his 1909 book, The Great Lakes and the Vessels That Plow Them. Curwood was a fiction writer, an incredibly popular one. And he was determined to prove that the Great Lakes held the exact same romantic, terrifying power as the open ocean.
So it was an intentional myth-making effort. He essentially looked at the lore of the sea and said, hey, the ocean has the Flying Dutchman, we need one too. And the Bannockburn, with its complete disappearance and its blood-stained vest, was the perfect candidate for a ghost story.
Exactly. He wrote that superstitious sailors would tell you in earnest that on icy nights, they had described the missing Bannockburn, a ghostly apparition of ice, scudding through the gloom. It was a very poetic, deliberate framing of the tragedy, designed to sell books and build a mythology.
But the sailors took that framing and ran with it. because the legendary encounters started piling up. Sailors would claim to see the Bannockburn's distinctive steel profile rising out of the ice and fog. They'd say they saw its lamps blinking in the storm said, forever searching for a lighthouse that was turned off. And over time, seeing the ghost ship became a memento mori, a dark omen of death.
Right, like a warning.
Yeah, if you saw the Bannockburn, it meant a killer storm was coming, or that your own ship was doomed.
It became a localized superstition, a way of personifying the sheer danger of the lake. But the most elaborate and arguably the most eerie of these alleged encounters happened decades later.
I am so glad we are talking about the tale of the Walter A. Hutchison. This story reads like a straight-up horror movie script. Let's reconstruct this. It's post-World War II. The Hutchison is heading toward the Sioux Locks in a massive winter storm. They are about 11 hours from Thunder Bay. The storm is so fierce and the ice buildup on their rigging is so thick that they have lost all their electronics. They are sailing entirely blind.
A direct, chilling echo of the Bannockburn's own fate.
Right. History repeating itself, and the wind is blowing hard out of the northwest, pushing the Hutchison dangerously close to the rocky shore. The captain is in a lethal bind. If he steers north into the waves will hit the broadside of the ship, shift the heavy cargo, and capsize them instantly.
Which leaves him with very few options.
Exactly. So he has to maintain his course and risk running aground on the rocks. They are literally bracing for impact. And then the crew looks out into the blizzard and they spot a ship on a parallel course. It's the Bannockburn.
The ghostly profile, unmistakable in the ice.
They lose sight of it in the storm for a moment. Suddenly, a spectral rocket, a distress flare explodes in the air. The crew sees the Bannockburn again, illuminated by the flare just 100 yards off their bow, and it is coming straight at them, ramming speed. Yep. The captain of the Hutchison panics, orders the rudder brought over hard to the northeast to avoid the collision. The Hutchison wallows in the massive waves, groaning, trying to put distance between them and the ghost ship. The Bannockburn passes safely behind them. And as the crew watches, the ghost ship runs aground on the rocks, violently rips apart at the seams, and then vanishes into thin air.
A spectral reenactment of its own demise, played out right in front of a terrified crew.
But here's the ultimate twist. By forcing the Hutchison to turn to avoid the collision, the ghost ship forced the living crew away from the exact rocks that would have doomed them. The ghost of the Bannockburn saved their lives.
It is an incredible cinematic piece of maritime folklore.
But I have to stop and push back on the folklore here because I like facts. When you dig into the archives and the shipping registries, there are no records of a commercial ship called the Walter A. Hutchison operating on the Great Lakes post-WWII. The story seemingly originates from internet blogs and gets repeated as fact.
Yeah, that happens a lot with these tales.
Plus, the Bannockburn had sister ships like the Rosemount and the Westmount, which had the exact same distinctive British-built profile and sailed the lakes for decades after 1902. Couldn't these sightings just be terrified, exhausted sailors seeing the Rosemount in the fog, panicking and assuming it's a ghost? Why do hardened, pragmatic, industrial sailors, guys who work with steel and coal, pass down these elaborate supernatural stories?
Because the truth of folklore isn't in its factual accuracy. It's in its psychological utility. This raises a fundamental question about human nature. Why do we need ghost stories? As you pointed out, pragmatically, it's highly likely these were misidentifications of sister ships fueled by exhaustion and fear. And the Walter A. Hutchison story is almost certainly apocryphal.
Right.
But we have to look at what the ghost story accomplishes for the grieving.
You're saying it's a survival mechanism for the people left behind.
Precisely. For the families in Kingston, and for the tight-knit maritime community of the Great Lakes, burying an empty casket provides no closure. A missing ship is an open, festering wound. If the Bannockburn simply impaled itself on Superior Shoal, burst open from wet grain, and rotted in the pitch black at the bottom of the lake, it's just a senseless, brutal industrial accident.
It's just a waste of life.
Right. It means the men died for nothing, crushed by a capitalist machine racing the ice. But by transforming it into the Flying Dutchman, by creating a narrative where the ship still sails, where it serves as a warning, or even a guardian angel like in the Hutchison story, it gives the tragedy meaning.
It reclaims the agency of the crew. It keeps the 20 lost men alive in the collective memory. They aren't rotting in the dark. They're out there sailing forever.
Exactly. The ghost story is a monument to their memory, built out of fog and superstition because there was no physical grave to visit. It takes 20 young men who died in absolute terror and darkness and elevates them into an eternal legend.
That is deeply profound. It transforms industrial horror into a lasting legacy. So let's bring this all together. We started with a compromised ship, an industrial marvel of steel and steam that had already been battered, bent, and stove in by the uncompromising lake.
Yes, dragging doom behind it.
We followed it into a terrifying November storm where a crew of 20 young men found themselves entirely alone in the pitch black, relying on flawed compasses and dead reckoning.
We witnessed the agonizing false hope inflicted on their families, the cruel telegrams born of a psychological need for answers, promising safety only to have it ripped away.
We looked at the chilling physical evidence that single blood-stained life vest with tied straps washing up on an icy beach, proving that the end was not peaceful, but a violent, frantic fight for survival in the freezing water.
Truly horrifying.
We explored the terrifying reality of uncharted underwater mountains like Superior Shoal, waiting in the dark to rip a steel hull open and let expanding grain burst the ship apart. And finally, we saw how the massive trauma of that void birthed a spectral afterlife, creating a ghost ship that will sail the collective imagination of the Great Lakes forever.
It is a dark, fascinating journey into engineering history, hostile geography, and human psychology. The ocean, even an inland one, always demands respect.
So I want to leave you with a final haunting reflection. The next time you find yourself standing on the shore, looking out over a massive dark body of water, whether it's the ocean or one of the Great Lakes, I want you to really look at the surface. Consider the fact that just beneath those freezing waves, perfectly preserved in the suffocating dark, lie the wrecks of thousands of ships and the souls of the men who sailed them.
Yeah, they're all still down there.
They are. And ask yourself, despite all our modern technology, our GPS, our radar, and our boundless human hubris, if the lights went out on your steel island tonight and the storm started howling, how easily could you become the next phantom ship swallowed by the dark?